Awesome. So why don't we give everybody just a minute to get into the webinar and then we can get started. That makes good sense. So on my clock, it is 4:01. And so let's just give everybody to 4:02 to get squared away. If that sounds good to you, Shannon, over there at Schoodic.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So everyone who's joining us, we're going to get started at 4:02 by my clock, which just happened just now. I love the way that works. So hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this Project ASCO Assessing Seaweed via Community Observations webinar. It's being recorded. So we'll put that in the chat as well. The webinar is being recorded. And speaking of the chat, we would love for everyone to know who's in the webinar today. So please, if you could put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat, that would be awesome. So just take a second and put your name and where you're from in the chat. That would be great. And thank you. This webinar today should be about 1 hour. The talking part should be about 40 minutes and allowing 20 minutes for Q&A. Taking those numbers with a grain of salt. The Q&A should start at about 4:40. If you have questions, you can put your questions in the Q&A. There's a little icon on your Zoom screen. Just tap that, start typing in your question, tap the send button to send the question, and we'll answer as many of those questions as we can during the Q&A. Shannon, who I'll introduce in a second, is going to be running the Q&A board. And if she is reading through the questions and one seems to be similar to something else that's being asked, then she'll sort of send you a little note saying, I think so-and-so asked that, or something to that effect, so that we can make sure that we get to all the different questions that get raised during today, if there are any. So with that, again, introduce yourselves in the chat and we'll get going. And again, this webinar is being recorded. So hello, everybody. I'm Hannah Weber. I'm the Marine Ecology Program Director here at Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. Schoodic Institute is a nonprofit partner to the National Park Service. Our mission is to inspire science, learning, and community for a changing world. The Marine Ecology Program at Schoodic focuses on intertidal ecology, both rocky and soft sediment intertidal, as well as stakeholder engagement and involving everyone in the process of science. And Project ASCO to us typifies all of those things. In addition to running the Marine Ecology Program here at Schoodic, I'm a PhD candidate in the University of Maine's Ecology and Environmental Sciences program. I study the effects of harvest on rockweed ecology as part of the Conserving Rockweed Animal Systems for a Sustainable Harvest, or CRASH team, which is led by Dr. Amanda Clemmer. Critical to the project and the project's success, also here from Schoodic, is our technician and seaweed lover, Shannon O'Brien. Shannon's running the board today, and for those of you who are making it out for in-person trainings, you will definitely be seeing both Shannon and me in the field with you. So thanks. We are very grateful to the advising group we've worked with for over the last year and a half through COVID. This team has helped us develop and troubleshoot the project to this rollout point. Everything that works is thanks to them, and anything that doesn't work is, well, it's down to us. But we know that with input from citizen scientists, we'll be able to fix it and make it better. So a huge and enormous heartfelt thank you to all of our advisors. In this webinar, we'll cover some basic Ascophyllum or rockweed biology, some intertidal ecology, and then of course, Project ASCO itself. The project aims getting started, collecting data and accessing data that has been collected. We will follow up this webinar with in-field, in-person trainings. However, we've not settled on the dates or locations for those in-field, in-person trainings for this fall. But we do have everyone's email addresses and we'll be sending out updates. Also, as a note, The scientific name for rockweed, as we're talking about this afternoon, is Ascophyllum nodosum. I will call it ASCO for short, or rockweed throughout this talk. Rockweed is, of course, the colloquial term that's applied to many different seaweeds growing on rocks. Today, it's specific to Ascophyllum nodosum. So Ascophyllum nodosum equals ASCO equals rockweed for the next hour, a little less than an hour. So Project ASCO really starts with a question. How much rockweed is there in the state of Maine? And really the answer at this point is that we don't know, but we should, for a couple of reasons. As the coast of Maine continues to change and use of resources along the coast change, we need a coastwide baseline against which to measure change as it's occurring. Rockweed is harvested. It's used for nutritional supplements, it's used for food, it's used for a highly effective fertilizer and soil conditioner. It's got a lot of uses and it's exceptionally good for what it is being used for. It's harvested to about 16 inches or 40 centimeters, and it regrows after being cut, taking 2 to 5 years to add back on the weight that's being lost from cutting. This is a graph of landings in the state of Maine from the Department of Marine Resources, and we can see that harvest has increased along the coast of Maine. This is coast-wide landings. So we have year on the x-axis, starting with 2001 going to 2020, and we have millions of pounds here on the left y-axis and landing value in dollars on the right y-axis. And you can see that in 2020, slightly less than 16 million pounds were landed, with a total dock value of a little bit more than $700,000. Okay, that's great. Still doesn't tell us how much rockweed there is on the coast of Maine. So here's the page from the 2014 Department of Marine Resources Rockweed Fisheries Management Plan. And there are different amounts of rockweed measured at different locations through time. The amount of rockweed is not consistent along the whole coast. In some places, there's reported to be 35 kilograms of rockweed for every meter of rockweed bed. So we're seeing that in one location, and then we're seeing as low as a little less than 1.5 kilograms for every meter of rockweed bed. So we know about these locations, we know what's being harvested, but we don't know about that whole coast of Maine. If we were to take these values and do sort of a back of the envelope calculation using miles of Maine coastline and estimating that maybe 80% of that was covered with rockweed. Again, this is back of the envelope. We're totally estimating. And then we said, we know how long this is miles of coastline wise. And let's imagine that the average bed width from the shore side down to the water side is 15 meters, 46 feet wide. And that's a gross overestimate for some places and an underestimate for other places. And we took all of this information together and we sort of did ballpark range of how much rockweed we thought was in the coast of Maine. We get something like this and we say, okay, the coast of Maine is like 6,000 kilometers long. That's an estimate. All of these are estimates. And I think that should, and an average of 15 meters wide. We had to convert the length to meters. So we get 67 million square meters of rockweed along the coast of Maine. And then we take our numbers out of this, this thing from the fisheries management plan, this table from the fisheries management plan. The long and the short of it is that we get wildly divergent estimates about how much rockweed there is along the coast of Maine. We could have 207 million pounds, or we could have over, 5 billion pounds. We don't really know how much rockweed there is. There's a lot of space between those two numbers. So not knowing how much there is, we really don't know how harvest stacks up against what's actually here. That's one. Two, continuing with our theme of a changing coast, we know that the Gulf of Maine is warming rapidly and that species ranges are shifting northward as the water warms. So what about rockweed and the range of rockweed? This is a map of the current range of rockweed. So it's just a North Atlantic species. It's not found in other oceans, and it's only found in the North Atlantic, coming down to about New Jersey on the Western Atlantic and coming down to Portugal on the Eastern Atlantic. What we do know about changes in range for rockweed looking forward and about rockweed health with a warming ocean come largely from lab experiments and from computer models. The next slide is a graphic that I'll walk through slowly as I can. This is from a 2018 study using different computer models. That's what's along the top. Hadley, CCCMA, Zero, etc. Those are different models. And along the sort of y-axis, there are different climate scenarios or different input data. And these are different types of seaweed and how they're going to perform with different inputs, squeezed through different computer models, and how their range is going to shift looking from now to 2100. So what we can see here are those red bars are telling us how far the range is going to shift on the southern part of the range. And so we have this in hundreds of kilometers. So we can see Ascophyllum, my mouse up there for you all. So Ascophyllum is up here and it's down here. These are two different scenarios. But the takeaway is that Ascophyllum, regardless of the model, is going to lose its southerly range. It's going to migrate north. It's not going to expand terribly far into the north, but it is going to, the southerly end of it is going to move. And we know from lab studies that as water warms, rockweed will grow more slowly. So there's a lot of variability in this. There is great genetic diversity in rockweed, and it could be that the southerly end of the species is already adapting to warmer waters. But to the best of our scientific ability at this point, we know that the range is going to shift northward and that rockweed will grow more slowly in warming water. So that's our changing coast. And that's what we're sort of thinking about when we're thinking about Project ASCO. We have a changing coast. We have a change from a coastal resources perspective. Again, this is sort of why we feel as though we need this coast-wide baseline against which to measure any change. So you could be sitting here now, hopefully on the edge of your seat, I'm sure, thinking, so what? Why does it matter how much rockweed there is from an ecological perspective? In this veritable sea of seaweed, why does it matter how much rockweed there is? And so we're going to have a quick look at intertidal ecology with a little bit of rockweed biology thrown in to answer that question. Why does it matter from an ecological perspective? So any of you who have ever been to the intertidal have quite likely been there at low tide to look for things under seaweed. To back up a little, the intertidal zone is that area between high tide and low tide. It goes from trees down to the sea, and obviously when the tide goes out, the intertidal zone is exposed to air, and when the tide comes in, it's submerged in seawater. So the stress from immersion or air exposure increases the closer you get to land, and of course decreases the closer you get to water. There's always going to be that submerged subtidal. There's always going to be that exposed land, but then there's that middle with its stresses. The physical stresses increase as you get away from the water, chemical stresses, biological stresses, and just the very unpredictable nature. In the summertime, broiling hot, and then the winter time, the tide goes out and it's freezing cold. So there's great unpredictability. So the organisms that exist here are adapted to this very stressful and changing environment. Where rockweed exists in the intertidal, it's permanently fixed to hard surfaces like rocks with a holdfast, not roots. And from there, it grows into this branching frond structure. It has vesicles or air bladders that allow it to come up into the water column when the water comes in. And rockweed can grow to be over 270 centimeters tall. It's 78 inches, a tall person. The average height across the coast of Maine is lower. It's between 70 and 90 centimeters, roughly 30 inches. But because of this branching growth in the intertidal, rockweed actually acts as this foundation species that modulates the environment. A couple of minutes ago, I said, if you've ever gone into the intertidal, you've gone at low tide and you've looked under things to find crabs, sea stars, you flipped over rockweed, you flipped over rocks to be in that environment. And this just sort of points to that foundation role that rockweed plays. When the tide goes out, rockweed acts as a blanket. It traps in moisture and it keeps things cool in the summer. And that allows for the survival of other algae and animals that would otherwise dry out or yeah, they would dry out or they would roast. When the tide comes in, going back to that branching structure, rockweed creates this 3D habitat that's really a backdrop to a game of hide and seek between predator and prey. It also limits light down at the rock surface. And then as the water's coming in and out, it brushes the rocks with its fronds. And between brushing with fronds and limiting light, it really modulates what can settle and what can grow on the rocks down below it. So that's rockweed, this foundation species, really modulating the environment of the intertidal where it exists. And so also when we think about ecology, we think about food webs and that kind of interaction. So I'll touch on that in a second. Rockweed does not contribute to food webs in an obvious, in this obvious sort of herbivore, thing to be eaten by an herbivore way. It's a little bit more complicated. I'll get to that in a minute. First, I wanted to talk about the rockweed life cycle because it is important to Project ASCO. So rockweed reproduces once a year, and the reproductive cycle for rockweed looks like this. In the fall, rockweed starts growing receptacles which house gametes, eggs and sperm. Through the winter, the gametes form and the receptacles grow. In the spring, roughly March, April, the gametes become mature and they release into the water. The sperm can swim, the eggs cannot. The eggs are negatively buoyant, they start sinking, and the sperm actually swim away from light. So they swim toward the eggs, even though they're really swimming away from light. And there's 100% fertilization. This is amazing, 100% fertilization. The fertilized eggs drop to the substrate below the parent alga. Some fertilized eggs may be carried up to like 7 meters away, but really by and large, everything drops pretty much right where it's being released. It's great. However, it's sort of the settling out, that forming of a holdfast, the not drying out, the not getting swept off your hard rock, and the avoiding getting eaten. Those are all juggernauts for the rockweed. Vanishingly few fertilized eggs survive to start growing. So to complete the reproductive cycle, to go back to that, after the eggs and the sperm are released, usually this process ends by the 1st of June at the latest, the receptacles are then no longer necessary for this alga, and so they drop off. And the whole thing starts again, the cycle of reproduction starts again with the growing receptacles again in the fall. This will become important for Project ASCO in a second. I did want to sort of bounce back to the other role of rockweed in intertidal ecology, and that's the food web role. So you might picture sort of snails, eating the rockweed, and they most definitely eat tender young rockweeds, but rockweed invests heavily in anti-herbivory chemical defenses such that once it's gotten to a size, it's not going to contribute to the food web through direct herbivory. It's not going to contribute all that much to the food web through direct herbivory, but instead, remember those eggs and sperm and how there's 100% fertilization, but they're just tempting little protein packets with little beta carotene in them, and they get eaten. And so there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of food that rockweed provides for the intertidal ecosystem in that way. Then there are these receptacles that fall off, they break down and enter the food web through filter feeders. And finally, the largest contribution, there's a lot of storm-torn rockweed or ice-ripped rockweed that also breaks down and enters the food web through filter feeders. So the major pathway through which rockweed enters the food web is via detritus. It's really a detrital contribution to the food web. So to summarize, we have this seaweed that contributes to coastal and intertidal food webs. It moderates the environment where it exists. It will change its range and growth patterns with a changing climate, and it's harvested, and we don't know how much there is. And Project ASCO wants to contribute to an understanding of how much there is as a baseline against which to measure change. So this is where Project ASCO comes in. We're looking for help in measuring how much rockweed there is along the coast of Maine. Why? Again, because the coast of Maine continues to change and the use of resources along the coast are changing, and we need this baseline. There's this data gap, and we know that data will help us all make better decisions. However, I introduced you to Shannon. I'm one person, she's one person. We cannot collect data from along the entire coast ourselves. And we really don't want to either. It's not really that much fun, though I like Shannon an awful lot. So working with folks who like to get out and muck around in the intertidal and perhaps collect some data, this is how we can get those baseline data that we all need for rockweed. So that's the why, and this is the what. We're using a standard protocol to collect good rockweed biomass data from along the coast of Maine and share the data. We worked with an advising group to develop a straightforward protocol to collect rockweed biomass data. And we based that protocol on an industry standard for collecting rockweed data in the field without having to cut it down. So the rest of this talk will be about Project ASCO. It's going to be more of an overview. Again, we will have those field trainings this fall, and then we will also have some again late spring, early summer next year. So I'm just going to go into more of the what, sort of the getting ready, and then collecting data, and then accessing the data once it's collected. Do have a couple of notes that I want to make sure everybody understands before going into that, though. First of all, the citizen science protocol is to be used between June and mid-October. Remember, we went through the reproductive cycle, and this has to do with when we can sample. This period, the June to mid-October, represents the time after rockweed has completed its reproductive release, but new reproductive structures for the next year have not become too weighty. So we haven't messed with reproduction, and also we're not trying to correct for the amount of weight that's added on to the alga from the reproductive structures. A couple of other things that I want to point out. The citizen scientists who we would love to have be involved in this project need to be able to walk on slick and uneven terrain to get to the rockweed. They need to be able to squat or kneel to collect the data, and also need to be able to at least briefly lift up rockweed samples to be able to weigh them. So there are some physical requirements with this project, and I want everybody to be aware of those. So to get ready, you need to assemble your team. This protocol is for people working in pairs or in larger groups. It's really not conducive to working solo. Getting ready also involves, of course, checking tide charts and the weather. The protocol takes about 2 hours in the intertidal, so it is best done about 1 hour before a low tide to 1 hour after low tide, and should be conducted, of course, on days with good weather. Getting ready also involves identifying one or more locations for collecting rockweed biomass data. Your sites should be accessible both for getting to and also for moving around and once you're on site. The vertical sides of rock faces with rockweed hanging down, those are not appropriate sites. Those are not helpful, and they're very dangerous. We can help you find your sites. You know, this can be a conversation. It's not as if you just have to go off and find your own site. You do need to ensure that there is ample off-road parking for wherever it is that you have chosen for your sites if you're driving to the site. Or if you're walking, there needs to be a safe way to walk and get into your site. You also need to make sure that you have permission from the landowner to conduct data collection. And of course, you need to assemble your gear. Oh, I also want to mention as a point of safety, you should also leave a field plan with somebody who is not going out into the field with you, so that somebody knows where you are and approximately when you think you will return. It's always good practice. And then there's assembling gear. So Schoodic through the Project ASCO will be providing 2 30-meter tape measures, standardized CPVC squares or quadrats, 5 of them, spring scale, weighing bag, and a bucket to carry it all, and of course, a paper copy of the protocol to refer to. You would need to bring, or you will need an account on Anecdata, which is where the data are being held, and a mobile phone or a tablet with the Anecdata app downloaded. We do also have paper data sheets, for which you would of course need the data sheets, a clipboard, and a pencil, and you wouldn't need to take a mobile phone into the field if you didn't want to. One note there, you would have to make sure that you remembered to enter and upload the data once you got back from the field. There's also, of course, pure personal gear. This data collection effort is best done wearing closed-toed shoes, highly recommended, and long pants, also highly recommended, and then the other appropriate field clothes, typically layers, hat, and making sure that you're prepared for changes in weather. Protection from the sun, bugs, hunger, dehydration should also be accounted for. Knee pads and tight-fitting gloves can be very, very helpful, as can field guides or mobile phone apps such as Seek and iNaturalist, which can be good for when you're looking at the non-rockweed parts of this amazing and incredible ecosystem. Collecting data, we are again using the anecdata.org app for collecting data. And the app walks you through the data collection, starting with what the site looks like and ending with any notes that you can contribute. So the app is set up to sort of walk you straight through all of the data that needs to be collected while you're out in the field. So once you've gotten ready and you've figured out where your site is and you've gotten to your site, and again, we'll help you if you aren't sure if you have a site that you want to get to. We can certainly help with that. Then you need to set up the area where the data are coming from. So we set up an area as is shown in the schematic on the right and in person on the left. We measure the width of a rockweed bed, so from the shoreline down to where rockweed ends closest to the water. We measure that width. Then approximating the center halfway between the shore side of the rockweed and the lower part of the, we set out a 30-meter transect that runs parallel to the shore, that runs parallel to the shore side or the water side. We then also measure the width of the rockweed bed at both ends of that 30-meter parallel transect or line along the shore. We then toss out 5 quadrats. These are half-meter quadrats, half-meter squares. They're tossed haphazardly on either side of that 30 meters, not too far. You're not trying to like chuck them into the middle of nowhere. They are kept relatively close to the 30 meters. And it is a-okay if some of them land on areas that are not completely and utterly covered by rockweed. That happens quite frequently, and it's nothing to be corrected for. That is part of the site. Then the collecting of the rockweed, we then sort of move aside all of the rockweed that is not growing from inside the quadrat. So that really all that we're focused on is the rockweed that originates from within the quadrat, and we move aside everything that is not growing from within the quadrat. Several of the rockweed then get measured for their height, not all of them. Several of them get measured for their height, and then we collect the weight. So for the weight, again, we provide these for people who are joining Project ASCO. We lay this mesh bag. It's actually a flat piece of, doesn't look like a bag when you start. It's a flat piece of minnow mesh. We lay it against one edge of the quadrat, flat. Then we lay all of the rockweed into the bag. The bag then gets cinched at the bottom and cinched all the way up. and then weighed with a spring scale. There is, of course, a little bit of art to that so that we're not pulling up on the rockweed. We do move the bag out a little bit, so to have a little bit of give in the bottom of the rockweed so that we're not pulling up and getting an erroneous weight. Again, this is something that that we talk through extensively in the field and in-person training. So there are spaces, of course, to enter all of this on ANIC data. And you can also enter all of your quadrats at once. You don't have to keep re-entering data over and over and over again. But once the rockweed is weighed, it gets placed back in its quadrat, and then you just move on to the next quadrat and repeat the process until you've repeated the process for all 5 quadrats. And that's the data collection in a nutshell. When you're done, you make sure that your field site, you've collected up all of your field gear, you've left the field site as you found it to the best of your ability, knowing that there will be 5 little piles of rockweed. The tide will come in and address, and smooth out those piles. But we do try to minimize our impact on this environment. But that's data collection. To access not just your data, but all of the project data, you can go to anicdata.org and click through to our project, Project ASCO. And you can download any or all of the project data. There's a download the full data sets right there on the front. Anyone can access the data. When you're uploading your data, there is an option to obscure where exactly it is that the data came from, so that the data end users have an approximate location, but not an exact location, if this is important to you, and it is to many people. So there is that key feature on ANIC data. I do want to point out, of course, there are many, many, many different ways to determine the biomass of rockweed. We can use drones, and they are being used. We can use aircraft, that's being used. We can use satellites, that's being used. Each one of these changes the amount of resolution that they can get. And, every one of these has a plus and a minus. We believe, of course, that Project ASCO data can stand on its own, or it can be used with remote efforts. So an end user like myself can use it, or any other person, or it can also be used to help with assessing rockweed biomass remotely. So again, coming back to the why. So this is the why of Project ASCO. Why, the coast is changing and how we're using it is changing. We want to safely collect data from as many places along the coast of Maine as is possible between now and mid-October 2023, which is when we'll take a step back, evaluate. We're doing continuous evaluation, but that will be a larger evaluation to determine how to move forward. But we also want to talk about rockweed, and we want to be in this amazing place we call the coast of Maine. We can't do it alone. And indeed, like I said before, we don't want to do it alone. And as we know, we're not the only ones who like to play in the intertidal. So we are looking for people who want to go out and collect data in conjunction with this project. So what can you or what can anyone do next? How do you get out there and contribute to this project? Again, we are still settling on dates and locations. We are trying to find locations along the entire coast to run our in-person trainings. So what do you do next? You come to an in-person training either this fall or next late spring, early summer, or both. I'm not going to keep you from doing that. And at the trainings, of course, we will train and we will provide equipment. So your commitment, should you join this project, which we hope you do, your commitment is, of course, to attend an in-person training session, to get a gear bucket from Schoodic, to choose a location that has a rockweed bed. You can choose more than one. Certainly don't want to limit anybody. We can help you find locations that meet the criteria. Again, safety is key, safety and accessibility. We then ask that you safely visit that location during low tide, collect data in the field, upload or send in your data to anecdata.org, and communicate with us. Let us know how your experience was, through email, through forum, through social media, a quick phone call, anything. We have your email addresses, and we'll email you all of the listings of the trainings. And you also have our email, and can email us if you have the perfect location in mind for yourself, but also for groups of people to learn how to collect rockweed biomass data. We are still looking for locations for training, and we're super curious to see what people have out there. Again, if you join, or even if you don't, you want to tell us where we can go look at rockweed, but we'd rather you join the project and you collect rockweed data. You can communicate with us through our emails, or you can upload anything that you might want to share through a hashtag Project ASCO on social media. You can also share through Anecdata. There are ample places there to have community exchange of information. So we will be sending out stories and summaries of data at the end of 2021, 2022, and 2023 field seasons. And we encourage everyone to send us recommendations about what it is that they want to see in those communiques. And we invite anyone in the project who wants to join us in the field when we're out there going to the sites we're going to join us out there as well. Again, I really would rather you get out, do your own sites. But again, this is about community data collection. So we'd love to get out there with a bunch of people. And with that, I am happy to answer any and all questions that you have. And thank you.
Yeah, you have a few questions in the chat. One was answered while you spoke, which was about measuring the height to determine the forest factor of floating, which you mentioned we do take heights. So person hit back answered. And then another question was how to deal with the weight variation by the time in the tidal cycle, the desiccation of the water leaving.
Absolutely. And that's a great question. So for those of you who might be thinking about this, right, as the tide goes out, rockweed is still fairly moist right after the tide's gone out. And then as the tide is staying out before it comes back in, it's sitting out there in the sun if it's a sunny day, and it does start to dry out. We do correct for that by taking the time at which you collected your data, and by knowing when low tide was on the day that you collected your data, we can then do a back calculation looking at how rockweed dries through time. So we do have lab data, do not have field data, it's true. We have lab data on how rockweed dries through time, so we can then add in that correction factor. It's a great question for sure.
Yes. You also have a hand up from Vicky. So if they like to ask their question, I'm going to allow them to talk.
Okay.
Maybe. Okay. We'll give Vicky a moment. So on that, you have another question about how often do you visit a site? Is there a quota per site?
Oh, yeah, great question. All right, so there's not, but you could, and I don't, you could just visit the site once. You could adopt a site that's very large and systematically go through the whole site. You could also adopt a site and visit it through time. Where our funding is, right, this is being funded, goes to 2023 for us. And at that point, we assess and evaluate, the data where we might need other locations, whether we do want to return to some other locations, et cetera. So it really depends on what you want to do with your data and with your data collection effort.
And the same person hit you with, do you have a preference for overtime or revisiting at this, or yeah.
So our goal, our initial goal is to get to as many sites along the coast of Maine as possible. So that's our first and primary goal, is to get to all different sites. There is, of course, utility in having data in the same places through time as well, like what happens if there's a big storm, or et cetera, so on and so forth, and how does change happen in one location, and that is awesome and critically important. It's just the nature of the way our funding is set up right now is that we can't follow that data with you right now with what we have for our structure. You can, the data will always be on ANIC data, and that data portal will always be on ANIC data. So it depends on what you're doing.
Speaking of the areas, is there an area of high priority that they would be looking to identify a site in to further help us, because it's a site we're looking at for a particular reason?
No, we're making an attempt to return to all of those sites that was on the table that I listed out before. And really there's not. It's close to where you are, close to where you identify with as being the coast of Maine. Close to locations that speak to you. I'm not 100% sure it would be very wise for me to say, drive up and down the coast, all of us in our cars, electric or not, to get data from everywhere. So really, for anyone, I would recommend prioritizing places that are close to you and that speak to you.
Yeah, I'm with that. I love the spots that speak to me. Another question was about, is there any way through this project that we would be locating high biomass areas that the industry would then use to promote harvest in that area, knowing now that it is ripe with rockweed?
It's absolutely a possibility. Let's not pretend that it's not. However, I would say that the harvest companies, all of the harvest companies operating in the state of Maine, know they have already identified the locations where they are harvesting and where they intend to harvest. They have identified the locations where there is a commercial amount of rockweed. So this contribution of data is not going to change all that much for them. To that point, what I would say is that the industry is very good at knowing those data. They aren't necessarily great at sharing those data, which means that the Department of Marine Resources don't necessarily know where those areas are. So yes, harvesters have access to these data. Regulators also have access to these data. And we all, including coastal landowners, have access to these data. So there are many different constituencies that have access to these data.
We have interest. Somebody has a place on the coast. Could they collect data from their own bay?
They could, again. So the first thing is I would encourage them, since it is their own place, to obscure the location. Just if they feel, if that's where they want to go with what they're doing with these data, to obscure the location, they absolutely could. That would certainly cut down on the whole getting landowner permission and where are you going to park your car sort of thing. So that'd be awesome if they did that. Absolutely.
Are we limiting the number of field sites in particular regions or towns?
Absolutely not. We could end up with a map at the end of this project, or at the end of this first couple of years of this project, where we find that, you know, there have been some hot spots where lots and lots of people have gotten out, and there are some spots that have received very little attention. And so we're not limiting. It could be after after 2021 and 2022 that then we put out a couple of specific calls to action. You know, we've noticed that, Cape Elizabeth, we have no data from Cape. I'm just making Cape Elizabeth up, by the way. We have no data from Cape Elizabeth. You know, let's put out a call to action and get some folks out there. But there really isn't. And honestly, from a citizen science project perspective, we have multiple teams who end up going to one or two particular locations, and that's an awesome way for us to make sure that the data we're getting is brilliant data, because if we have more than one group, either a pair or a group sampling in one location, then it tells us how variable the data are at that one location with different people sampling.
And somebody's says, out of interest, who is funding the project?
Sure, this project is funded by the Broadreach Fund.
And do we have a plan for gathering data in or around our many Maine islands?
We do not, except I will be talking with the Maine Island Trail Association to do just that. I think that's actually critically important. I think that that's most definitely understudied on the coast, and that would be very, very important.
If we were measuring only the height of some rockweed, how do we determine which ones to measure?
Yeah, we'll go over that in the field. And so we do select either 3 or 4 from each quadrat. And we have an infield method of selecting which ones, so that we don't all just get the super tallest ones. We don't all get the super shortest ones. We do have a method in the field. Yeah.
Is this protocol being used in other states on the coast?
No, rockweed harvest really is not such a massive thing below Maine as you're going down the coast. And so, no, it's not. Again, we did base this protocol on an industry protocol. So this is the preferred field protocol for many people in industry who are not sampling by cutting rockweed down, which they really don't do all that much of, and who also are not using remote sensing techniques. This is an adaptation of the industry standard measuring method.
That is the questions I have thus far in both the chat and the queue. One just came in. In an area where rockweed grows fairly high, as much as 12 feet, how would one apply these field protocols as a physical manner?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. Sorry to say. Like, is the bag big enough to fit rockweed that's that large? Is that?
Or I suppose measuring it to height if you are not tall enough to reach it. We usually hold it up, but oh, yes, things like that, measuring it, weighing it, etc.
Sure. So sometimes we've been out on the field and we have this tape measure and we're measuring our rockweed, and suddenly it's taller than our tape, and what you do is you just hold the rockweed at that point. You pull your tape through till the 0 is at your hand, and then you just keep measuring till you get to the next point. And then there is a way to measure the height of rockweed that is very, very large. And we can certainly go over that in the field. And in terms of weighing, the weighing bags that we use, there are instances where the rockweed that is originating from inside the quadrat, it doesn't necessarily grow in such a way that you can sort of flop all of it into one bag. And this could apply to where you have a lot of large rockweed as well. And that is that you take only some of the rockweed and weigh it, and then you put that as, you sort of flop that over one side of your quadrat, and then you take the rest or another clump of rockweed and you weigh that. There are spaces in Anecdata so you can get more than one weight per quadrat if your quadrat is just overwhelmed with rockweed. So there are also ways to accommodate large or super girthy rockweed in the protocol.
Do we have a one-page brief yet interesting description of the project that I could forward to people I know to recruit them?
We will by the end of the month. We do not have a one-page brief, but see, this is the whole thing where our advising group probably told us to do that. And this is where the advising group was smart and everything else is on us. So we will make sure there is one by the end of the month.
Are we only interested in sites with abundant rockweed beds, or are more sparse areas of interest?
Sparse areas are also of interest. Again, getting to that variability along the whole coast of Maine. I think if we just went to places that, were like these lush beds of rockweed, then it would skew how we're thinking about rockweed along the coast of Maine, because it isn't only, lush beds of rockweed. In some places it is really sparse, but it still plays that foundation role even in those sparse locations. So yeah.
That, as of this second, is the questions I see.
Awesome. Well, great. You have our email addresses. I guess I should go back to that slide. Am I still sharing my screen?
You are.
Okay.
And Catherine also put the Schoodic link for the project in the chat. So you do have some information to that.
Yes, that can serve as our one pager. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, so definitely, if you have more questions, if you want to get involved, if you want to ask us to send you a one pager to send it out to your colleagues, please get in touch with us. And we do have all of your email addresses so we can communicate with you when we have lined up the dates and locations for trainings along the coast. So if there are no other questions, then thank you all very much for coming out this afternoon. And I hope to see you all soon in the Rockweed. Should be great. Thanks.
I'm gonna